people remember coming out of the womb, but I don't. I remember from 3rd or 4th grade. I came along in Miners Mills, Pennsylvania, in 1928. I was the 13th. There's lots of us. There's Irving, Maxie, Bobby, Ray, Sammy, Phil, and Henry. And there's Hannabella, Ruthie, Pearlie, and Sally. that should be 12, and myself is 13.
Well, I remember my grandparents, all 4 of them. My Bubby Rose told me all kinds of beautiful stories that were sort of like Fiddler on the Roof kind of thing. She was very young when she got married. I was told she met my grandfather right before or during the wedding. She said, when I looked at him, he was so tall and handsome, I was in love immediately. It was in the period of time when there were pogroms going on all the time. People were being killed. They were being pushed from one village to the other. And they left Russia on their honeymoon, knowing they would never come back. They went to London, and they stayed there a very short time and didn't like London. It was gloomy, it was foggy. And so they picked themselves up and went to New York. My grandmother then went on to bring all of her sisters, she had 3 sisters, to the United States, but she never saw her parents again.
My mother and I were very close to each other out of the 13 children because I was the baby. My mom and dad both came from Poland. My mother's name was Gussie Brandsdorf. And my mother came to this country earlier than my father. My mother ended up in Exeter, Pennsylvania, and my father ended up in Exeter, Pennsylvania. He came from the old country when he was about 19 years old and needed a place to live, and he lived with her parents where he boarded. They met at that house. I don't think they courted each other very long until they got married, and from there they moved to Sherman Street in Wilkes-Barre. He was doing stove parts in those days on a push wagon, going to houses and fixing stoves.
My mother is Lillian. She was Lillian Levine and became Lillian Kaplan. My mother was first, my Uncle Sam was second born, my Aunt Shirley was the 3rd born, and my Auntie Ann was the 4th one, and I knew them all. My father was Abe, and my father used to like to go fishing. He didn't like to be dressed up. He would be wearing jeans now, but they were khakis then. He was born in Lithuania, which was part of Russia. When he came over here, he was 4 years old. And then they had 2 other sons. My Uncle Joe was born, and after that, my Uncle Edward, who we called Abby. He was very close with me. Growing up, he taught me how to ride the 2-wheeler. He took me places. My mother worked in New York. She was a young girl, and she was in charge of 17 people making hats out of high school. And she got this job in a hat factory.
But that's what her grandfather
My grandfather was in the hat business, and my Uncle Sam did hats, but they always worked for somebody else. They never owned any hats. The Liebermans in Wilkes-Barre were cousins to my mother's family. They invited my mother as a teenager to come to Wilkes-Barre, which she did. And they had a party to introduce her to the young Jewish people in the area, and my father was invited. And that's how they met. He was 5 years older than her, and he took one look at her, and he was smitten, and he was in love with her. He courted her 14 hours driving time. There was no major highways, and cars were like you see in the movies, and he just brought her to Wilkes-Barre.
When my father moved to Sherman Street, there was a bakery, a local bakery, and he worked as a baker in that bakery for many and many a year. He not only baked for his company, he baked for us every Sunday morning, and the boys had to knead the bread on Saturday night and so forth and so on, from the oldest down to me. And my dad spread his wealth. If he had 5 loaves of bread, those 5 loaves of bread were spread over. We may not even have 1 loaf left in the house. The next door neighbors to blocks, and I say blocks away, loved my father. And then there was a gentleman in town by the name of Major, Morris Major, and he had a meat and bologna company, and he asked my father to come work for him as a salesman. And he ended up working as a meat and bologna man. The funny story of all of that, Major Provision was once on Northampton Street in Wilkes-Barre. And I happened to stop in Major Provision. My dad was there, and I said, "Can I have a nickel?" He gave me the nickel, and stupid me, I put it in my mouth for some reason or other. I swallowed the nickel. And I never told my father.
When she moved to Wilkes-Barre, my mother immediately opened a hat store.
Every hat she sold
was handmade.
a original design
yeah.
by her.
She would put on the ribbons, she would put on the feathers. The most expensive hat was $2.98. Most of the hats were a lot cheaper than that. My father had a tire store. It was fixing and bicycles and tires, and he went from that tire store into appliances. So he sold all kinds of appliances, refrigerators down to toasters, radios, and he taught himself how to fix things from Popular Mechanic magazine and other magazines that he would buy. And he would show me. Many times he would say, "Come here, Hindy," and stand behind me. "I'm going to show you how a refrigerator works." And it helped me in high school one day because I was called on, and I stood up and I said it that the whole room got quiet. I was so excited and happy that day. Every place we lived when I was growing up was behind the store or above the store. Always had very nice apartments. My father's parents lived right near us, near the store. My grandmother, Sarah Kaplan, was always sick, and my memory of her is just oy vey and oy vey. She didn't talk English. My name is Helene, but she couldn't say that, and she was the one with Hinda, and so I became Hindy. My grandfather was wonderful. He was very sweet. He was the shamus in the shul, and his name was Isaac Kaplan. And he came to live with us for a short time. He said to me one day, Hinda, come on with me. I want to take you someplace. And he didn't drive. So I said, okay, where are we going to go? He said, we're going to walk down the hill. And we went to the bank. And he gave me all the money he had in the world, which was $600. But in that time, that was a lot of money. He wanted it to be for me.
Abe Savitz, who owned American Furniture Company, wanted my father to work for him as a salesman. My father was a salesman on the road, took cloth in the car, rag rugs, curtains, sheets, and pillowcases. The business was called the schmata business, but in English it was a cloth business. I had a bar mitzvah on my 13th birthday, and my father's boss came to the house. He asked me if I wanted to go to work. I was 13 years old. And I said, yeah, I would like to go to work. So he says, all right, every day after school come in, and on Saturdays come in, which I did. So I was working from the time I was 13 years old.
father was very strict. He didn't believe in mixing in and raising the kids, so my mother did it. And then it happened to me. My husband didn't believe in him mixing in raising the kids, so I did it. So I guess I was like my mother. My father would be working. He was fixing radios, whatever. And my mother would take us, Marilyn and I, we would walk all the way down to town. We would go to the Irving Theater, or there were a lot of theaters in downtown Wilkes-Barre in those days. And then we very often would walk into Perugino's on South Main Street for their minestrone soup. My mother always wore a hat. And I remember one time we met a lady who was going down, and we were coming up Stegmeyer's Hill after doing this movie and thing, because we did it very often. And she said, "Oh, Mrs. Kaplan, I love your hat." And she said, "Well, you know, I have these hats in the store. Come in the store." "No, I want that hat. I want your hat." And my mother sold it right off her head on Market Street. Can you imagine anybody doing that now? Kaplan's Furniture was in 3 places on East Market Street during that period of time that I was growing up. My father got a few things, a couple of kitchen sets, a couple of chairs, not too much, but catalog books. And so that's what started the furniture business. My mother would make the hats. She would buy all the parts, the flowers and the ribbons, and she had big deep drawers, and I loved to play in that place. We would get paid a penny if we would hang up all the hats on those tall hanger things. The stores were side by side. They were separated with room dividers. She would say to the people coming in, "Oh, your daughter is getting married. Is she going to be needing furniture? My husband will give her a good price."
My mother died when I was 15 years old. When my mother died, we had a sister who was married to a fellow by the name of Max Siegel. And at that time, he was being a huckster on the road. Huckster was a person who went out and sold vegetables from a truck. That's what they called a huckster. My father decided that maybe Bella and Maxie and Carol should move into our house, because all that was left at the house now was me and my dad. So they moved in with us, and Bella basically raised me the rest of the way. I was going to school. By that time, I knew your Nana.
The very first time I remember seeing Irving, it was the junior high school in the schoolyard, and he had a cast on his arm. And I didn't know him, but I said to him, "What's the cast for?" And he said, "I broke my arm." And everybody was signing the cast. Now we were in high school, and Jim made you dance. They would bring the boys in, and they would bring the girls in, and they would line us up, and the boy had to go over and ask a girl to dance. And Irving came over and asked me to dance. Then we were dancing, and he said to me, "I really shouldn't be dancing," but I didn't want to make a fuss. I said, Why not?" He said, "My mother died." And he said, the month isn't up yet, that I shouldn't be dancing. And I remember that like it happened the other day, because I didn't know what to say. It's like it was an embarrassing thing. And after that, we really started to become really good friends. Nobody got rides to school. We walked. And accidentally, every morning, walking to school, here would come Irving from Wayne Lane, and we would walk to school together. Later, way later, he told me he would watch out for me.
I didn't have to go that way. I could have went down another way closer to the school, but I came out this way. We didn't really date, but the crowd would go out, and we would be, and then, shall I tell posterity what you did?
that
With Diane?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Diane and I were best friends, and she was at my house. And Irv was there, and a few other people were there, and she said, "Oh, Irving, will you walk me home?" And he said, "Well, sure, Diane, I'll walk you home." Well, next morning, bright and early, she wakes me up with a phone call to say, "Oh, guess who asked me to the AZA dance?" And I said, "Who?" She said, "Irving asked me." And my heart sunk. I couldn't believe that my best girlfriend he asked to the dance and not me. Well, Irving couldn't stand it, and he fixed me up with a date to come in their car. Do you remember?
Yeah, we double dated.
We were friends and we were dating, and then we were on automatic. It was like we were a thing. It was like understood.
But the War of 1941 happened.
When he called me on the phone and said, "I joined the Navy," I felt like my whole world dropped out. I said, "You what? You're not going to go to school? You're not going to graduate?" He said, "I have to go in the service." Everybody was in the service.
Ray was in the service, Sammy went in the service, Bobby went in the service, and Maxie went in the service. So basically, I was the only one home. I decided I wanted to go into the service. This was in 1945. I was 17 in May, and I joined the service in June. And my father took me down to what was then a post office, and he had a sign for me because I was too young. I was just going to be starting my senior year. I went to Sampson, New York for my boot camp, and we won the marching flag, which gave you a night in Geneva, New York. Well, I was 17 to start with, and I never knew what a drink was in my life, and had my first beer probably, and I got drunk, and I came back. When I looked on the roster, I had guard duty that night, and I fell asleep at guard duty. They didn't do anything seriously to me, but they made me stay in boot camp 2 weeks longer than normal. And in that 2-week period is when Germany surrendered. I got in, they knew I got in, they ended the war. And then from there I went by troop train to San Francisco, and I went on a ship, and I cried all the ways out in the Pacific. I was just lonesome. I realized what I did. I thought I was kind of stupid of what I did.
And he wasn't with his regular buddies.
I wasn't with them. No, everybody was separated by this time. And I finally got over there, and they put me on the ship that I ended up surfing my full time on, which was a floating dry dock. I started chipping decks like every sailor does and painting chips. And then I thought this was not for me, and they said there was an opening for a pharmacist mate. And he said, "I think you're qualified to do that," because I worked in a drugstore for a week. And took me over to one of the sections, and they were giving needles that time. He says, "If you can give a needle, you can be a pharmacist." And I started giving needles. And the next thing you know, I had a whole ship to myself. I was the only pharmacist mate on the ship. But the war was ended, as we said, so everybody was going home also. So the ship that had 100 and some people on it ended up with 14. The most important two people on the ship was the pharmacist mate and the cook, because the pharmacist mate had the alcohol that they were drinking, and the cook made the food. The captain didn't mean anything, the officers didn't mean anything, just he and I, and we were the best of friends. And
Home in the USA, we had ration books. You only allowed a certain amount of sugar, a certain amount of meat. He's writing me letters, And he's telling me about, we had steak again. I am so sick of steak. I can't look at a steak.
That was the easiest thing for the cook to make. He wasn't going to make a meal for 14 of it.
So letters kept coming, and then money started to come. He didn't know what to do with his pay. He didn't have any place to spend it, so I should save it for him. Well, in those years, a young girl comes into the bank and wants to open up a joint account. They wouldn't even let me open the account without my mother or father signing it, let alone put his name on it. No way. Things like that didn't exist. I mean, you couldn't do that. So anyway, I think what I did was just have it in my name, and when you got home, I gave you all the money back. He went and bought clothes. So the joke was he was sending me the allotment. My allotment checks were coming. We weren't even engaged. We were still kids.
Knowing that the war was over with, I had fun. I had a lot of fun.
Not only did he have fun, he did a stupid thing for a $5 bit. $5 bit.
But the doctor was my partner. The wing wall was at least 5 stories high. The doctor and I took a bet that we could go off of this into the water. And we did it, the two of us. And in the water, swimming around, were barracuda fish. Barracudas are very dangerous. They come at you, they'll eat anything. And we had the guys up on top with guns shooting out around us to make sure. The bullets could have hit us, not only kill ourselves with the dive.
I had graduated high school. I decided I would use my grandfather's money that he gave me and go to college. My father said girls don't have to go to college, and I said, well, I have my own money. So I marched myself into the college, and I said I don't expect to graduate. I would just like some more, to learn some more, everything English. I wanted English, I wanted grammar, and they sent me right to class. I paid the money for, and I only went one semester. And then he came home.
I came home in 1946 from the service. As I got discharged from Norfolk, I took a bus to come home to Wilkes-Barre. I knew where my father stopped every day. And the bus happened to stop at that diner. I got off of that bus there instead of going home. And I sat in the diner because everybody knew me. And they said, he'll be here, don't worry about it. My father, sure enough, he came, right? Right on his time, he came to have his coffee or whatever it is, and we hugged and everything else. And I went home with my father. When I got home, they already had a Kaufer meeting. The ones that were around, Maxie, Bobby, Ray. If I would do the family a favor and work for my father, which I did, and then he had a heart attack. Then he couldn't work. So I went back to my job at the American Furniture then. And they made me a traveling manager. I went to Binghamton, I went to Syracuse, I went to Watertown, and would live in a boarding house.
When we got engaged, we were not quite 19.
I gave her a ring for her birthday.
He hands me the box, and he said, here. And that was how we got engaged.
And then her father called me back that evening. He wanted to talk to me, and then I was plenty scared. And he congratulated me and so forth. It was on a good terms. And he said, how would you like to come work for me? Well, I was making good money at American Furniture, very good money for those days. But I went home to see my father. What do? I says, I'm making 3 times the money that he offered me. He says, well, you can't own American Furniture, but you can own Kaplan's Furniture Company.
That's true.
So I said, well, does that mean I go to work for my father-in-law? He says, that's what I'm telling you to do. Well, I went down, I guess, or called, whatever the case would be, and I told my future father-in-law, that I would come work for him. That was in 1947.
My father was very nervous because I was in the office doing the bookkeeping, and all you're going to be doing is smooching with each other all day. So we made up we didn't even talk to each
That's
other.
right.
Do you remember that? We didn't even say hello to each other.
We got married in the synagogue on Wall Street, Yad Shemesh,
We got married in
and
the
we
basement.
had the reception downstairs.
We went to Florida. We drove down in his father's car,
Brand new Hudson.
Hudson car. That was
Brand new
fantastic.
Hudson.
I didn't drive. The first day, we left the hotel very, very early in the morning. We come back, the room is not done up. So I had to call down, asking Mrs. Kaufer. It was hard to say. Is there any reason that our room wasn't done up? It was like 90 degrees out, you know. Just a moment, we'll check. She comes back and she said, we thought you were in the room.
All day.
The two of us were kids, we didn't know anything. We were dying to go to a racetrack.
We weren't old enough to get into the race.
But nobody stopped us. And we went to the racetrack and we bet $2 and we won, and we bet $2 and we won. 3 times we bet $2 and we won, and we now had like $19, which
Something
is,
like
we were
that.
talking about a lot of money. And so we went to a nightclub that night. We have a table for 2 and it was beautiful and it was very exciting. We look at the menu and I said, what are you going to have? He said, I'm going to have a filet. I said, you're going to have fish? He said, no, filet is steak. I said, no, filet is fish. Every Tuesday my mother makes filet, and it's fish. It's always fish. What do we have in filet? He said, no, filet is steak. So called over a waiter. That was our first fight, and he won. We moved in behind the store until we were able to get an apartment.
I became an assistant on the truck. So I used to make the small deliveries in the morning. Then Pete would come in, Pete Demtition, and we would make all of these deliveries.
And he would go dressed looking like a delivery person with those heavy plaid shirts. So then my mother calls me on the telephone and she said, Hindy, why doesn't Irv dress a little nicer to come to the store? I said, I asked him that, and he said if someone would teach him or ask him to be a salesperson, then he would dress different, but he's working on the truck, Mom. So my mother went and told my father, and the next thing that happened was if he puts on a shirt and he dresses nice, I'll teach him and he'll learn. And that's how he started to work in the store. Then he started to be a
But there was
salesperson.
a situation. The store was open 9 to 9. So I went to her father and I said to him, I said, you know, I was working 9 to 6. It's bad enough. That's 6 days a week, 54 hours there. Now I'm adding on 3 hours every single day, the same 6 days a week. That's 18 more hours. Don't I get any extra pay or commission on what I sell and everything else? He said, we'll see about it, we'll see about it. And I got fired.
You got fired.
The 6 to 9 I got fired.
No.
Yes, I did. Then he made a deal. You come back, work the 6 to 9, and
Yeah.
we'll pay you a couple dollars an hour for each one. So I said, all right, I'll come back to work. And then Marilyn married Marvin.
Marvin had his own store in Edwardsville.
He
He's-
closed that store. He brought the merchandise that he had in that store to our store, which was linoleum and paint. That's how Marvin became a partner. It was a partnership between Abe Kaplan, Irv Kaufer, and Marv Steadman. That's what it was.
Well, when I got pregnant the first time with Gloria, my father decided you cannot raise a baby and not have a cottage at Harvey's Lake. So he went out to the lake and bought a lot. And then
He put me to work. But Poppy knew what he was doing. We had a customer, gave him a deal, and he put the roof on and he put the framework. And then he, Pete, and I went from there and did every stitch of work.
all of the lumber was secondhand lumber.
He didn't believe in spending another nickel than he had to spend.
No.
So what he did, there was a house next to Boston store that was being torn down. This is when they were going to put their garage, you know, the parkade or whatever you call it there. And he went and made a deal with the people that were tearing down the house to buy all the doors and windows out of this house. Our truck, which I was a driver of, took it out to the site. And then I was pulling nails out of all of the second-hand lumber.
A potbelly stove he put in there to heat up the place because it was freezing. And I was reading Gone with the Wind all winter long, and Mama Lil was there to make sandwiches.
Pete and I were nailing up walls at night with lights like you're showing right here. We put the windows and we put the plumbing and we put the electrical work. We built it and we moved in.
When men build a house, they forget that you have to put dishes and clothes somewhere. We had no closets and no cupboards. However, I loved it. I loved the cottage. My memories are wonderful of it. And Gloria and Terry got to go to the cottage, and Marilyn would come with Sharon and Howie. We would move out Father's Day and move back a week before Labor Day.
Yeah.
My mother, God bless her soul, she loved us, but she wouldn't let me get a babysitter, and she wouldn't babysit. Because what if she wants to go down to the bingo, or what if she wants to go out? So then I'll get a babysitter, Mom. No, I don't. I want privacy. So that was with the cottage. So we put up with it because we all lived there in the summer. And if you want to have relaxation, you have to put up with everything else. But so we did. I loved it too much not to ever give it up. We would walk down to the beach. And I used to like to read on the beach, so I told my kids they're not to bother me while I'm reading unless they're bleeding.
I used to drive out every night after work. This particular time, I had a station wagon, and it had Kaplan's furniture on the outside of it. And I'm driving out there, and the siren is going off. The siren, the state police are after me. And the state police comes over, and he says, "You know, I missed the payment this week. Would you please tell Mr. Kaplan I'll double up next week?"
My father had a heart attack or two, but his heart wasn't very, very good when he started to have some strokes. He had a stroke in Florida when they first bought the condo. And we called down, and I remember saying to my mother, "So how are the lovebirds in their new little nest on the beach?" And my mother was very sad, and she said, "Daddy doesn't feel good and something is wrong." And they took him to the hospital, and he was having a stroke. We decided to go down with all of our children, and my father seemed to be doing pretty well, so we were going to drive up. However, I was very nervous about it. And one whole night I walked around, and my mother saw me walking around that little condo, and she said, "Hindy, what can I?" said, "Ma, I have very, very bad vibes about driving Daddy home. He's not really good there yet. He's still having problems." And she said, I know too." She said, "You don't want to drive home." I said, "No, I think we should fly home," which is what we did. And we weren't home too long when he was having some kind of an attack from the Harvey's Lake. He drove my mother in such a rage that she couldn't believe it. He was driving fast and not stopping for lights and really having a time. And that was the beginning of the end. Mama Lil was a doll baby, and her body was in very good health. And the bad luck was Alzheimer's. I denied it up and down. Her friends started to call me that something is wrong with your mother. She is doing this and that, mentioning things having to do with memory. We checked it all out as much as we could. We even took her into New York, and there was nothing more that we could do. And so I took care of her as much as I could in her apartment. I shopped for her, and then there was a place. It was a daycare for seniors with problems, like my mother's. My mother loved it. She always had a boyfriend, and I got a call from there one day with a problem. "You know, your mother has a boyfriend." I said, "I know. They always sit together." Well, he gave her his wedding band. He was like my mother with Alzheimer's. His wife was very upset. I said, "Never mind, I'll get the ring back, and this is what I did. The next day I picked her up and I said, "Ma, you found my ring? I have looked everywhere for it." I said, thank you, and she handed it to me. She ended up in a nursing home for 9.5 years, but she died of a heart attack. We only had 4 grandchildren when I decided I'm having a necklace. And so it started with Dylan and Ryan and Matthew and Trevor. And then one day, Gloria calls me on the telephone and she said, "Ma, that necklace that you always wear around your neck with all the boys, does it come in a girl's?" And I felt myself burning. I thought, somebody wants to know about my necklace. They want to copy it because somebody had a girl. This is what I was thinking. And Gloria said, "Calm down. Order the girls." That's what she was telling me about Stacy. She knew it was a girl, and she was telling me she was pregnant. So now I have 8, 5 boys and 3 girls. And when Pam had the 2 girls, Stacy said to Aunt Pam, "You have tripled our girls in one day." How long have we been married now?
56 years.
I just can't believe when people used to be married for 25 years, I thought they were pretty old. And I don't feel as old as you should be when you're married 56 years. We always make up before we go to bed. That's our secret. Yeah. He has to be good to me.
I don't know nothing. You're never wrong, so...
That's right. Then so finally you're admitting it.